It's a delight to be here today with Aron van Os, who is the brother of Lucas van Os, who's been on the channel several times already. I'm really eager to talk to Aron. He has a background in philosophy, and you're a professor of
Yeah, not a professor. I'm more of a let's say a TA, a teacher's assistant or
teaching
assistant
assistant.
professor. It depends on which context you use that. But
Uh-huh.
I'm a teacher, a seminar teacher and
You're
lecturer.
teaching philosophy.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah. And your specialty is Nietzsche.
correct.
I
Yeah.
have some questions about Nietzsche. Um, and there's there are a few things that I can say ahead of time that I'm going to ask you so you can be thinking about them. One of them is Nietzsche's Hammer. And
Right.
one of them is the whole concept of forgetfulness as an active and positive force
Hmm.
in Nietzsche. And then the whole idea of the will to power and how that relates to free will and freedom of choice and all of that.
Hmm.
So that's a little teaser for those who are just tuning in, but I want to start with Aron's life story and find out how he came to be someone who would end up teaching Nietzsche. So you can
Right.
start with your childhood. That would be good.
Yeah, my childhood. Yeah, well, I was sad to be without my younger brother, who most of you will now know for the first 4 years of my life. Um, during which time I think I was just always a very positive, happy child, I think. I don't think I was known to be philosophical. I think that um, that came a little bit later because I was raised in a religious household, and I started having doubts, I think, around my teen years, strong doubt, and this was always a bit confusing for me because uh, I did still very much appreciate certain elements of Christianity. So let's say I was always into certain specific Christian uh, artists who I appreciated. And even if you have doubts about, let's say, for instance, the existence of a God or something like that, it's still difficult to then say, oh, so now I no longer like the music, for instance, like, so I always felt drawn to, for instance, that aspect of it. And in a similar way, I had simply met so many wonderful people who were Christian at that time that it was never something I could entirely let go of. And at the same time, yeah, I don't know, it was, I do think it very much formed me because I was, yeah, amongst friends who were all interested in, uh, having, let's say, more philosophical conversations. And for me, those were always centered around the meaning of life, because that was something that wasn't self-evident for me anymore, whereas it maybe was before. And I think a lot of that I found in music for that part. So I became a musician. I think I started playing the guitar actually fairly late. So I think I was 15 years old when I started playing, but I had a knack for it, I guess, which is why I went on to try out writing songs. And then, unfortunately, at the end of my time in secondary school, I think I went through a time of what could be characterized as depression, where I could still find something in music, where I didn't have a very strong faith, um, and also where I just felt very confused in terms of, okay, I'm gonna start having to choose, I don't know, a kind of career path, or at least what kind of program I want to follow at maybe a university or something like that. But I absolutely did not have any of the motivation for it. And I genuinely didn't know what to do. And at that point, I thought, okay, it's just going to be me on my, like, on the couch of at my parents' place for a year or something like that.
So
And
let me just ask one question here.
yeah.
Was the lack of motivation to figure out your future
Hmm.
tied to the depression, or did the depression start because you were so uncertain about your future?
I mean, I think many people who have felt depressed will find it very difficult to answer that question, simply because it's always such a complex of phenomena. So at the time, I was also not in a healthy relationship with my girlfriend at the time. So that also was an element to it. And it's really hard to say, looking back on it, how much of it was simply me, for instance, becoming more aware of the complexities of life at that age, me losing my faith in God, me being in a very difficult relationship, and then indeed that combined with, okay, me not knowing what to do in the future. But I do think the latter followed from the first. So I think me not knowing what to do, like some people describe feeling depressed as not even being able to see color. I mean, obviously we all do, but you don't like see the quality inherent in it. So it doesn't. So you feel somewhat indifferent to things around you, and I think that was also the regard with like, okay, why, I was almost like an activist, like, okay, why should I even have to fit into this system? Like why is this burden all of a sudden on me right now at this age? So I just and I think that motivation would have come far more easily had I not felt the way I felt at the time. And I think, yeah, what can I add to that? Yeah, and I've had certain like episodes of falling back into depression later, like very rarely, but when I did, I became so cynical. So it's like, so I started thinking about other people, and I became so cynical about their motivations. I saw everything as a power play almost. So that was always very interesting to me, to then, when I felt, a little bit better again, to see like, oh, I'm genuinely unable to experience any strong positive emotion except for that which is fleeting, let's say, for maybe a moment. And at the time, I was very grateful for my dad, because he had gotten a job in Dublin, but he was only going to be working there, let's say, or he only had to be there once every 2 weeks. So for him, it was already gonna be necessary to book a hotel every 2 weeks. So he was like, okay, we're gonna find something for you in Dublin, and then I'll take care of the rent, but then I can stay over at your place when we're there. And then we found this music program. So I did, yeah, I actually managed to achieve like a songwriting degree in that 1 year that I spent in Dublin. And I think that's definitely what I needed. It was still a very difficult time. I was very much by myself a lot of the time, but that was also sometimes very generative. And I did a lot of songwriting then. You then also notice, like, let's say, who are your close friends, because there were several people who visited me, and that's always different than the everyday quality of secondary school. And I think, I, let's say, went through a process of individuation that was barred a little bit previously. So that was a very formative experience for me. But I also knew that when I was then a musician, I was still interested. I remained interested in these bigger questions that sort of had haunted me since I more or less had, I don't know, stopped believing in God is always such a big word, but definitely God wasn't so present. Let me put it that way. And that's why I became interested. Okay, I do want to go to university, but I don't want it to be defined yet. So I went on to do a liberal arts program at the University College Roosevelt, which is in Middelburg. It's a very small, let's say, fishers town in the Netherlands. They called it like a small Oxford almost. It's really it's very beautiful. If you're ever in the Netherlands, I can recommend you go. But it's also very boring. Like, I actually lost, basically, I almost felt more distanced from my friends than when I was in Dublin, because it's so sort of at the other side of the Netherlands. And at that time I was like, okay, now I need to really, I don't know, it was like a new beginning for me, and I need to figure out who I am. And I thought I was going to be either a historian or an economist. I don't know why, but it just felt like, okay, now I really have to commit, even though I don't like it. And then I noticed fairly quickly, okay, I'm not going to be an economist, I'm going to be an historian. And then while doing history, I ended up taking one philosophy course. And this really surprised me, because it was, I don't think I ever knew. Like there was already a possibility to study history in secondary school, and I never did. So I'm not sure why I missed out on that. And when I took my first course, it was like this feeling of liberation, like, oh, okay, wait, this is the place where I can rethink all those questions, but not but in a very new way. So that's also why it's rethinking. It wasn't so much tied to, okay, now I have to go, let's say, for instance, back to church and have to submit to something that I feel is behind me. But I genuinely felt like I could do this in a new way. And I think I did so at a time from an unbeliever's perspective. But the interesting thing was that my professor at the time, he was an American, and he also had grown up in a religious household, but he was traumatized by it. Let's say like he took like the John Vervaeke route, but then to full-on resentment against Christianity. And that was always interesting to me, because then I felt that he would sometimes, and this was part of his work, he would criticize Christianity almost in a way that was extreme to us in the classroom, because, well, most of us were just atheists. So it's more like, we didn't care. It wasn't an issue for us. We weren't like emotional about religion, but obviously I was in some ways. So when I noticed his criticism against Christianity, I was like, well, this is not fair. This is not the Christianity I grew up with. So all of a sudden I got drawn back into like, okay, but is this really the Christianity? And then at some point, one of the authors we read was Friedrich Nietzsche, who, and that was just very difficult for me to read, but also very eye-opening, because when I first started reading Nietzsche, I was like, okay, this person actually understands Christianity and he's criticizing it. So that felt much more of a blow than everything else before. But I think there's something, and this is also, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but it's part of what I argue for in my work, and I think this started already, like I had an inclination of this, is that Nietzsche is actually far more appreciative of Christianity than is often seen. It is a very complex relationship, and he is also arguing against it, but he's also very much appreciative of it. And I think I already felt that at the time, because I was like, why is he so obsessed with these questions? He's not like a simple, he doesn't simply dismiss it. He's more like, he's also talking to all the unbelievers, like, you have not realized what you've done. Like, this is going to be the end in some ways of our morality, of our whole conceptualization and valuing of truth. So we need to be very careful of what we do next. And I think that always spoke to me, that I was like, okay, I need to be aware of what I'm gonna, let's say, miss out on if I'm genuinely gonna pursue this atheist, I'm not sure what the right word is, but this route of rejecting Christianity. And by being so concerned with it, I actually became interested in it again. And also I noticed that there were, like, that's another aspect of philosophy. We just discussed so many questions that you can rethink. For instance, questions concerning the existence of God, or a question concerning morality, that are not simply from an empirical scientific perspective, because at that time I thought that was basically all there was. And then I knew, like, okay, there's actually far more ways of thinking about God's existence. And that, I guess, opened the door for me, like, oh, okay, now I'm definitely not an atheist. I'm like agnostic. I allow for the possibility. And then I guess the Nietzschean aspect got me emotionally engaged again, and got me desiring to, like, yeah, what do I want to do with this? So that's just a brief summary. And then I studied that, went on to do a master's, and started teaching at that university at Utrecht. And that's where I'm still teaching right now. And I have done some research, I've done some talks, and at least I've managed to publish one article, but I want to hopefully turn this into a research project, which is why I'm now on the lookout for that, while being very busy with teaching. So that's a short summary of my life until now.
Wow. So what was the topic of your master's thesis? Or, I mean, do you do a master's thesis in the Netherlands?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. The topic, I think the title of my thesis was The Pious Antichrist, Nietzsche as a Religious Thinker. That was the topic of my master's thesis. For the people who are interested, I think you can find it online somewhere. So, right.
Nietzsche as a religious thinker? Is that the last part? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's correct.
The Pious Antichrist, Nietzsche as a religious thinker. I'm so far behind the wave because when I was in college, Nietzsche was kind of the in thing, but
Mm,
I didn't take that class. All my friends
mm,
took that class and they're all waving Nietzsche stuff around and they're all
mm,
really high on Nietzsche and convinced that there's no God and God is dead. And I mean, they kind of took Nietzsche the other way, probably because
mm,
they weren't very mature thinkers. But I was such an immature thinker, I didn't even bother to study. I had one philosophy class in college, but I found the whole thing so utterly boring.
mm.
And it might have been my teacher, but
Right.
the way that he introduced the different, he was kind of just giving kind of surface introduction to each philosopher. And then he would tell a little bit of their life story. And it seemed to me like every one of these guys ended up either insane or committing
Mm,
suicide. And why would I want to know what they thought? And so I just
right.
tuned out and fell asleep.
Yeah.
I guess because I wasn't interested in the big questions at that point in my life. I mean, I grew up in a household that was devoid of God and church and everything else, and but also not actively against anything, not
Mm,
actively for anything. It was just sort of an empty household. So I didn't have any sort of framework to rebel against or to be for. So I just sort of floated through the hippie years
mm. Right.
without any thinking. So I look
Yeah.
back on that now and I think, wow, I wasted so many years.
Well, I genuinely do think that Nietzsche is also not for everyone. I don't necessarily think it's a good idea to popularize Nietzsche. He didn't think that was necessarily going to be a good idea. Like he's also very careful about like don't necessarily follow what I do. Um, there was even one story that there was this Catholic lady that he at some point met, and the story recounts, this is what a friend of his says about him, that he actually with tears in his eyes told her like, please don't read my work, like he didn't want her to be confronted with what he had to say about it. So there's also something to be said why those people came away with that impression, because, and that's something I do argue, like there's also lots in Nietzsche's work, and actually more of it in some ways, that will indeed lead one to conclude that he was let's say an antichrist. That he was very critical of religion. But I would also say, like, just to add to what you were saying in terms of philosophers and madness, because I completely agree. I think it's also a sense of the tragedy that does appeal to me. So I'm fairly concerned about people who are Nietzscheans. I don't consider myself a Nietzschean, um, but at the same time, I believe that there's, like, let's say, shadow integration kind of aspects to these thinkers, and that's for the same reason that people are drawn to shows like Breaking Bad, where they see just this breakdown of a character in which they also become more powerful and more interesting. So you have the same with the Sopranos to a certain extent. So there's all these American TV shows of these characters where you both increasingly admire them as you continue watching their behavior and their thoughts and their ideas, but you're also like, right, okay, I don't want to end up where they end up. So it's like both teaching you a story of what not to do, and maybe also part of it, okay, but this is what you can integrate from it. And that's really very much how I look at Nietzsche. So I totally agree with you that the Nietzschean path is not one to follow. Maybe for a few individuals, but I even doubt that. But yeah.
Well, so you had pointed me to a video, which I'm going to put in the description section because it's really very good. It's a video by Dallas Willard where he's talking about Nietzsche and then contrasting Nietzsche and Jesus. Actually, he spends most of the time talking about Nietzsche, but
Mhm.
then he does say at the end of the day, um, which path which path leads to fulfillment? And he said, find me someone who is truly a Nietzschean, who has lived as Nietzsche taught we should live, who has been fulfilled. We'll leave that question open for now
Mm.
until we get to it later. Um,
Right.
but one of the things that, so I said at the beginning that there are three questions I wanted to talk about. One is Nietzsche's hammer, and I want you to explain that, and then we can talk about the idea. And then another one is this idea of choice and free will. There's a lot that wraps around that, including the whole idea of freedom. And then finally, the idea that forgetfulness is an active and positive force. So let's start with Nietzsche's hammer. And why don't you explain, first of all, what Nietzsche's hammer is?
Yeah, this is a very good question, because I think it's often been misinterpreted simply by what we associate with a hammer. You know, like so Nietzsche called himself the philosopher with a hammer, which is also why the book in which he explains that passage, it's Twilight of the Idols, or How to Philosophize with a Hammer. And that suggests that Nietzsche is out to destroy stuff, you know, like he'll take a hammer and he'll just destroy stuff. And that's often how he's taken to be. And there's something to be said for that, because he's very polemical in his text. But when he introduced the metaphor, he actually says it's more like, you know, a hammer that you use. I'm not sure what the English word would be, but where you place it on, let's say, like clocks, for instance, and hear whether or not it's hollow or not. So you can kind of hear, like, as he starts to look at, let's say, certain idols of the culture. So in that book he'll look at people like Socrates, like Napoleon, just all these very famous individuals, but also certain values, and I'll just see, like, is there actually something here, or is it hollow? And so it's more like a tuning fork almost, you know, like that'll hear, like, okay, what is actually the sound that this makes? And by doing so, I think he gives the strong implication, this very characteristic of Nietzsche's thought, is that none of these things are necessarily eternal. So he's not saying nothing is eternal. He's just saying be very careful with assuming that things are eternal, that it's just as simple that, okay, we have justice and justice is just eternally good. It's like, well, actually justice has also been very, let's say, situationally constructed in certain eras, and then been defined differently in other eras. So we need to be very careful in terms of how we value something like justice, because it might be that it made a full lovely sound at first, but now it will maybe sound hollow, and maybe there's not so much there anymore. So that's really what he's looking at. And that's why he's philosophizing with a hammer, because he's just, you know, he'll take a subject matter or an individual and he'll just like poke it from all these different sides to just kind of see like what remains. And interestingly enough, sometimes something remains. And that's, I think, why that's also good, because in that same year, he also released the book, The Antichrist. And in that book, he just, well, he does kind of destroy Christianity in some ways, but he has such profound admiration for the person of Jesus. So that also shows that he, in some ways, like, he used the hammer, and he's like, okay, I can tell that in the development of Christianity, and there's something to be said for this, because the shape Christianity had taken in the 19th century is something that many of us would reject today. And he finds that it's hollow, but there's something there at the core of it that he's like, okay, that's pure. And that's actually close to the ideals that he also set out himself. So I hope that kind of explains the concept.
Yeah, yeah. So the way I heard it described one time was that when foundries would make a brass bell, like for a church,
right? Yeah.
Oftentimes they couldn't tell if there was a flaw in the brass or the iron. What brass is made of iron and tin?
I think so.
Copper, something,
sure. Right.
Something like that. But there can be a flaw without it being visible. And so then if they go to all the trouble of installing it in the belfry and everything, and it's got this flaw, then what are you going to do about it? You know, because some of these bells are massive. So they had a little hammer that they would strike it with, and then if they strike it just right, the crack will show up, and then they would know, okay, there is a flaw. And and so when I was thinking about this, I'm wanting to ask you about it. One of the topics that came to my head was the idea of weakness and strength, because you know, Jordan Peterson's always going on about a lot of things relative to weakness and strength, and he was a great reader of Nietzsche. I wouldn't say he's a Nietzschean by any case, but he certainly read Nietzsche, appreciated him. And I think there's something about both weakness and strength that have this kind of polar. You could look at weakness from both sides. You can look at strength from both sides. And I kind of wonder how it was that Nietzsche would look at those things. And here's the reason I'm asking. When I was younger, I read Ayn Rand. When I first read Ayn Rand, I got really mad and I threw the book at the wall. In later years, I read Ayn Rand again and I thought, well, there's something there. I read her before I was a Christian. And then I read her again after I was a Christian. And it seemed to me that she had a deep misunderstanding of what Christianity is, because she understood Christianity from the perspective of kind of the way I hear Nietzsche talk about the weakness aspect, that it's weak and that it glorifies weakness and it glorifies altruism. But the kind of altruism that she was talking about is not what I see as altruism, like in the church and the actual generosity of God and the generosity of his people, but a kind of altruism that puts the onus on others to prove that they're being Christian enough by giving enough and creating this kind of atmosphere of guilt around everything.
Right.
And so it seems to me that Nietzsche might have a way through of kind of using the hammer to kind of dig into that and figure that out.
No, I think that's an excellent point. Yeah, he does also have issues with let's say the conceptions, the glorifying of weakness that is brought about, but mostly by how in certain understandings of Christianity, and for his part, this was already also happening, let's say, in secularized morality. So he'll similarly criticize, for instance, socialists. He also thought that socialists acted very much in the same manner. By trying to emphasize, okay, he kind of looks at the history of these conceptions of, let's say, good and bad, and he noticed that, good was just meant as a sort of, it was used as a positive self-evaluation. So if people were good, it was like, okay, you're good compared to something bad. It's like you could be good at cooking or you could be bad at cooking. There was not necessarily, like, let's say, a moral aspect to it. And he notices, like, he'll make the comparison with birds of prey and little lambs. And he says, like, like the birds of prey, they're good at what they do. Like, when they're hungry, they just eat. It's like there's nothing evil about it. They just do what they do. But he makes the point that if you then have a group of people, and he compares this with the lambs, they're not so powerful. They're not as powerful as the birds of prey. So they're just being eaten, and they can't do anything about it. They can't eat the birds of prey. They just have to endure it. And he says what actually happens in this case is that you get a group of people who just start, and this actually relates to your later question about the will to power. They nonetheless will want to, in some ways, express some kind of grip on reality. Like, they can't accept this state of complete powerlessness. So what they'll do is they'll actually start conceptualizing. And his point is, this is when they'll start kind of having these feelings of revenge against the people who are powerful. And if they have revenge against people who are powerful, the way to then talk about them would be like, okay, they're actually evil. So from the lamb's perspective, the bird of prey is actually evil, even though from the bird of prey's perspective, the bird of prey is good, and the lambs are just bad because they're not as good as bird of prey. But from the lamb's perspective, they're not bad, they're evil because they could not do this, but they choose to eat us. And if they're evil, and if we're not doing what they're doing, then we're good. And the problem Nietzsche saw with this was that, okay, you can kind of see, okay, there's obviously something to be said that there is something awful about, let's say, violence and eating other, creatures in some ways. But at the same time, there's also something very dangerous about, okay, I don't want any of that because I associate that with being evil. So I can only be good if I stay weak. Like, if I don't become like them. And then you see how that then gets taken up by, let's say, categories within socialism, which is something that Nietzsche was very critical of. Is like, okay, you have these powerful people in society, they are evil and we are good because we are not them, you know? So therefore, we're also going to stay weak. We're going to just, you know, just conceptualize them as evil. And if we do that, then maybe we can harbor enough revenge against them to eventually overthrow it. So he actually says, like, there's something dangerous about this, because if taken in the wrong way, you know, that sense of weakness will actually end up tyrannizing at some point. And that's also why he was sort of a proto psychoanalytic thinker. But I think, to your question, because I think it's very right that you point this out, this is not actually our experience of how Christians, for instance, like there can be a bunch of other people, think about the Good Samaritan, conceptualize their goodness. So sometimes you have that feeling that, okay, you know, I like they stay weak on purpose because they fear being seen by others in a negative way. But what Nietzsche is really trying to point at is that, okay, something was lost in that time. We can't return to it because now we've gotten basically too complex as creatures. Like we started intellectualizing stuff, which is what the lambs did in his little story. So we can't just return to this older state where we were, like, let's say, birds of prey, or where some people were birds of prey. But nonetheless, there was something good about that, because they were just evaluating themselves. They were just like good with regard to themselves. And if they wanted something, they took it. And there's something healthy about that, because they just immediately follow, let's say, what they want in some ways. And that's why he was very concerned that now there's a morality that is rising up, which is like, actually don't follow what you want. If you have certain tendencies, if you want to become powerful in any way, don't follow that, just negate that, just stay weak in some ways. But I think, indeed, to your point, is like, yeah, okay, but we also know many famous Christians throughout, and I think many of us who have been in Christian communities, we've found other people who are not so resentment driven towards powerful people. They actually find that positive self-evaluation, because they feel fairly motivated in this self-evaluative way to be good, and not just be good in comparison to other people who are evil, but really be good in comparison to themselves and to their own potential. And that actually approach is something that Nietzsche was much more a fan of. So there's something to be said for that. He is severely criticizing our evaluation of weakness, but it really depends on how we look at weakness, and if that weakness is also paired with resentment of some sort, because that's really the weakness that he was very much concerned about. And I do sort of agree with that aspect of it, but I'm curious how you look at that.
Well, the story that sticks out to me from Atlas Shrugged, which was Ayn Rand's 1400 page,
Yeah.
In many ways a very prophetic book, I think. Although it seems to me that she must have been a follower of Nietzsche in actually believing his concept of will to power, because what she lays out as the ideal individual is somebody who is actually motivated simply by their own ability to exercise their self-will in strength and but a productive, in a productive sense. She tries to give it the best version that you can. But the story that sticks out to me from that book, though, is the story of this guy who was one of the builders, I think he was the one that had the steel plants. Hank Rearden had developed this kind of steel that was his own invention, and so much superior to everybody else's. And of course, because of that, all the competition came in and said, that's not fair. You know, all the other companies said, that's not fair. We need to get the government to limit him because the rest of us ought to have an opportunity. So it's this little weak kind of, you know, it's not fair. We can't keep up with him. So you have to press him down so that we can, you know, keep up. And then he had this family, his wife and his children, who were like, you're always working and you don't really care about us. And if you really cared about us, you'd come home earlier. And if you really cared about us, you'd get us a nicer house. And if you really cared about us, you would treat us better. And so they're the weak the weak people, they're the representation of the weak who are self-righteous in their weakness, self-righteous in their desire to tear him down, because he represents this unmitigated strength. And of course, she paints these people with a very broad brush. It's very simplistic in many ways. There's not a lot of nuance in any of the characters, but it does point out very clearly this problem, which I think is a problem that you said Nietzsche is talking about, how this weakness can turn into such a vengeful. And I mean, I kind of see that happening in the world today. There are so many people who have considered themselves oppressed, but it's now becoming this very vengeful, retributive, active force that's going to blow up someplace, you know?
Yeah, and I mean, you can imagine just today, like so many people like sitting behind their laptops or computers and just, you know, being rageful on the internet, but not actually doing something. So obviously that's going to be their output, because that's where they feel they do have some control and something to say. But while doing so, they actually will over time notice, like, okay, this is actually not a useful output of, let's say, the life energy that I have. And therefore, like, if they're not careful, you know, they might join a protest. They might wear, I don't know, like a full-on mask and not be recognizable, and be surprised by how much rage they feel, and they might hit someone because they've actually built up so much resentment over the years that that's then all coming out. And that's, but they would be too scared to do that, let's say, face to face to someone, without the mask on, because they have never built up that self-confidence. They could only do it, like, let's say, from the veil of a mask of understanding themselves to be good, but they would not allow, for instance, to build themselves up in such a way that they could, let's say, really positively evaluate themselves. And I do also see the let's say, the risk of individualism in Nietzsche. I think there's some ways of going against that, and that's there too in Ayn Rand. It's really like, okay, so we need to be strong individuals. That's also definitely also has its downsides.
Well, so let's play the Nietzsche versus Jesus game then. Given this problem with the people sitting behind their laptops and letting their rage out that way, potentially maybe getting out on the street, and you know, we see this problem arising. So what would be Nietzsche's solution to that, and what would be Jesus' solution to that?
I find this really rough, because like, also I would then also need to distinguish, let's say, between Jesus and the church, because I would say, like, from the church perspective, you'd be like, you'd have to come to church, you just have to join a community, and you have to feel what it's like to be amongst people. Jesus' solution, I would find that so difficult. Like, I don't know, I don't feel like I'm able to actually do justice to whatever would be the solution there. But I do know, like, what is always inspiring about an individual like he was that he was both, you know, let's say, sitting down with tax collectors and with prostitutes. So like, it's like he's the most extreme right wing and the most extreme left wing kind of guy to like meet up with both those people. So it does show that he is willing to just sit down with someone and have a conversation. So I think in some sense that is the Jesus perspective, is to just treat these people as human beings. And that's the easiest thing, is to just treat them. I think as Chloe Valdery, like she also says, like, don't treat me as a political abstraction. I'm not that, right? I'm a full-fleshed human being, and treat me that way in the first place. So that's, I think, what Jesus would do. The problem with Nietzsche is that he's like, he would want you to want it yourself. And otherwise he's like as soon as Nietzsche starts caring. But this is always difficult, because Nietzsche is like, let's say, a split up personality. And in my work, I'm arguing for both sides, but he's often taken to be just this one side, which is very anti-Christian and stuff. But in that side of him, he would be not interested in helping out other people in that way, unless it would make yourself more powerful. Then it can be useful, but otherwise it would be of no interest. So to that person, I don't know, it would just be not interesting. But I'm not sure. Maybe you're asking what would be the Nietzschean thing to do for that person. Is that what you're asking?
Well, I'm selfishly thinking more of society as a whole. How do we keep our society from disintegrating, given
Right.
given this? I mean, it's very complicated to even talk about, right?
Hmm.
So the a lot of the I don't want to use the word I don't want to use the words that are typically used to describe this problem
Hmm.
because they're all insufficient. But some people use the word postmodern, some people use the word woke to discuss what's happening
Hmm.
in the world today that's wrapped around the problems with power and whether or not the world is constructed, whether or not the world is socially constructed or constructed around power, or that argument that's going on in the culture about power, and um, is why there seems to be this way of looking at the world as people who are um, powerless or oppressed, and the people who have power and the people who oppress others, categorizing everything through that lens rather than seeing that I mean, even Nietzsche's little story about the bird of prey and the lamb at least shows you that there's two sides on both sides. There's a lot of sides.
Right.
Everything is just way more complicated. Um,
Hmm.
but given this lens that's being disputed right now in the public arena, um, it seems like the world is going to fly apart if we don't find some way to get people to sit down and talk to each other,
Right.
get people somehow to recognize that there is value in the other, and that and to recognize, well, I mean, obviously you say go to church, yes, because one of the great things about church is you end up in church with people that you ordinarily wouldn't have anything to do with. I mean,
Hmm.
not that they're bad people, but they're just not the people that are in your circle. But then you end up in church and, oh, here's somebody that I would never have gotten to know otherwise. And then
Hmm.
you sit down and you talk, oh, they're real people. So I mean, that is one of the real values of being part of a church, I think.
Right. No, yeah, I totally agree. And I also noticed like when um when let's say, I was struggling with my belief in God, which to a large extent I obviously still am because I'm a philosopher, so it's always a question to me in some ways. But um I always noticed that, okay, but what is going to be the alternative for church? Like it's really difficult to see. I was like, maybe, sports clubs, but even that doesn't seem to quite cover indeed the just the vast diversity of people actually coming into an institution. And I mean, indeed, diversity, not just in the sense of do we have enough different sexual orientations or enough different skin colors, but genuinely different people, because that can be a risk of diversity, is having people that look different but actually have, for instance, all the same opinions on certain matters. And that's definitely been interesting in the church especially, but I also think in several other religions, is that the religion is so old that if it has survived until this day, it has to allow for diversity of opinion. Otherwise, it would have fallen apart at this point. And therefore, you see all this, even though, most people that go to church agree on the fact, okay, there's God and Jesus, and they're basically good, I put it that way. They still hold vastly different opinions about so many societal matters, which is actually a very positive thing, because in many, let's say, political movements, they're about now. They'll be uniting people much more on things we have to agree on today, and not so much all the diversity of opinion we have in certain ways. And that holds the risk of building up resentment to other political movements, and that will be far more difficult in, let's say, a religious tradition that has been around for a couple of thousand years. I would also just add that I think there is, let's say, a Nietzschean solution to society. I'm not saying it's necessarily the good one, but he always very much appreciated the religion of the ancient Greeks. So he looked at, especially let's say in Attic Greece, so at the time of Homer. So before all the philosophers came in, he actually I think he still really appreciated Heraclitus, but after that, like with Socrates and Plato, it all went downhill. Um, but according to him, they had this very meaningful, like almost like opponent processing in that language that John often uses, of the god Apollo and the god Dionysus. And it's like Dionysus, like it was this very extreme, much more the god of the passion, of drinking, of extravagance. And then you have Apollo, who is much more like, to say, the god of like clean outline. So there, it's much more separation, but in a very useful way. And this actually, Ian McGilchrist in his book, he says this is actually a very useful model to look at the best interaction of the left and the right hemisphere, where the left hemisphere is more Apollonian and the right hemisphere is more Dionysian. Just a very useful way of thinking about it. And he says, like, okay, so you had these two ideals, but they were constantly like challenging and in a way that they would reinforce each other. So it's not like one would win over the other. But then his point is that as soon as, like, let's say Socrates came about, and it was almost like, okay, it became more unified, but according to Nietzsche, like, let's say a negative way, because it was like, okay, all of life, we need to hold that to a standard. And for Socrates, there was like to ethical thinking. So he says, like, when are you happy? When you're virtuous, when you're virtuous, when you're truthful. So it's like all of these are interrelated to this one value that is above it, which is also eternal in some ways. And that's then even worked out in more detail by Plato. And to some extent, we can see that Christianity, when it comes about, according to Nietzsche, it has this risk of also just keeping it with this one value, whereas according to him, it's really good to have, let's say, more opponent processing. So I take his whole project to be that he's looking for a way to create opponent processing again, to really be like, okay, yes, the Christian value is an important one. Many people will think that this is nonsense, that this is not a Nietzsche, but there are so many passages, also in his personal letters, where you can see that he profoundly values the Christian value. But he is concerned that by itself, it has gone so strong that it ended up denying itself in some ways. Like that's something that Jordan often talks about. It's like, okay, like it ended up valuing truth so much that it started questioning, oh, why do we value truth? And, does God actually really exist? And maybe God doesn't exist. And then, the whole fundament for truth has basically slipped away, and the same for the fundament for morality. And he says, like, this doesn't happen if you have something that is constantly challenged by something else, which reinforces one another. So I take his whole project to be like, okay, I'm basically gonna attack Christianity almost to bring out its best aspects in some ways. So I think to that person, and that's a problem we have of today, we can argue whether there's only one value, which could be power. Like if we look at it from the postmodern perspective, it's like, okay, it's just power, and that's the whole understanding we have of society. Or whether we have so many different values that they're no longer in opponent processing. They're just kind of, it's just kind of a weird polytheism without any clear strengthening of one another, but just people that no longer talk to each other. So it's like, that they have no understanding of it. So he would, for that individual, he'd be interested in like, okay, what's your highest value? And let's bring that into competition with a different value so that it can constantly reinforce itself, and that it can also be reinforced, it can reinforce the other value. So that's sort of a more communal.
Doesn't that run into the problem of like, doesn't that become a dialectic?
Well, it depends. What do you mean by dialectic? Like there have been many uses of the word dialectic.
Yeah. Well, okay. So this is so interesting because we've landed kind of in the wheelhouse where my idea about art and creativity just falls right in this spot.
Yeah.
But if you have the one crystalline value, but then you always want to bring it into question against another value, that its opponent. My understanding of and like I said, I am totally not a philosopher. I don't really know what I'm talking about, but that you have these opposites. They come into a synthesis, and then the synthesis creates a new thing that you have to fight against, and so you're constantly in this battle. But that's also kind of I think it's Wolfgang Smith who talks about what we basically did was turn the escalator into a kind of just docked it over on its side. So it's no longer going up. We're just progressing towards something. We have no idea what we're progressing towards, just progressing towards the future, but there's nothing higher, right?
Yeah.
But my pick, when you started talking about the Greek, like
Dionysian
Apollo
and
versus Dionysus, versus the idea of Socrates, with the pushing everything towards this perfect thing that you have to kind of fit inside of. When I look at this from the standpoint of the principles that have been recognized as those which create beauty and truth and goodness in art, they're not it wasn't something human beings came up with. It was just something that they recognized as they look at art and they look at what people are drawn to. They recognize, oh, there are certain principles at work here, and those principles almost all have this binary sense to them, kind of an opponent processing. So you can have things that are always in this kind of a tension, but it's in a way, it's a loving tension between the two extremes. So large and small, dark and light, speaking artistically. So there are certain elements that that a work of art or the world are put together with, and those are, I've said them over and over again, everybody's getting sick of this, but line, size, shape, direction, color, value, and texture. Everything's composed of those elements. But then those elements have great potential for variability based on a set of principles that kind of are, you could call them guides or supports, or maybe some kind of graphic representation of, or projective geometry or something with all these lines that intersect. The principles are unity, harmony, contrast, repetition, variation, gradation, balance, and dominance. And those you can look at from a wide spectrum. So repetition, you could have no repetition all the way to just constant repetition, or you could have complete imbalance all the way over to solid balance. Anywhere along that spectrum. So let's take any particle in the universe, that particle is in a particular place and it's involved in a certain level of repetition with a certain aspect of unity, and whether or not it's creating harmony, it's an environment, or what the resonances are. So you can imagine every one of these spectrums has a point along it at which that particle is engaged, but they're all connected to each other.
Right. Yeah.
All these principles working together so that every particle in the universe is unique. Every thought that we have is unique. Every stroke on a painting is unique because that stroke is contributing to the unity or the harmony or the contrast or the dominance or the repetition or the variation or the gradation or the balance of the whole piece. But what that gives you is this beautiful display of potential for everything. So it's not, you're not locked into one thing. You can have beauty, truth, and goodness, but that is also composed of all these other things, and many places you can land on that spectrum. I don't know if that makes any sense.
No. Yeah,
I can see it in my head. I just can't explain it.
No, it's actually fantastic, because I think that's also, like, let's say in the best reading of Nietzsche, he also says, like, the opponent processing, it allows for, like, let's say you pull this tension more to the side, by which you allow for more potential, like, let's say, because otherwise it's too narrow and things become stagnant in some ways. But if you indeed, like, if you can stretch it out, And I think we recognize this when we, let's say, grow and evolve in our individual lives. We're also trying to like really stretch out our potential in some ways, that we can both, people who are introverts, they need to stretch out becoming more extroverted, or people who are too extroverted, they need to stretch out also being able to be by themselves. So I think that's actually a wonderful illustration of that, and that might be a pattern that is so wide that that it recurs on every aspect of the universe. And I also
that's
think
kind of what I think. I think it's what lies underneath the physical laws.
Right, yeah. And I think someone like Peugeot, he will argue that what Nietzsche maybe misses out on is that in an individual like Christ, you have a reconciliation of these opposites. So it's not like, the opposites are gone. It's just like they're indeed reconciled under one higher motive. And that doesn't imply that they become unified in that sense. But to Nietzsche's point then, okay, but in our historical understanding of Christianity, there's still a lot of it which is nonetheless sort of, becomes more stagnant and becomes less flexible. And it's actually like, no, everything needs to be this way. I need to understand everything this way and not also its opposite. So I think there's something to be said for both. It just depends on which aspect of Christianity we're looking at, and even for that regard, which aspect of reality we're looking at. But I think it's amazing what you just laid out. And I would also say art was profoundly important for Nietzsche, because for him, art was this way of seeing, like, so he would problematize our valuing of truth a little bit. He would say, like, okay, we want truth at the expense of everything else. And maybe that's a little bit of a problem, because sometimes maybe truth is not good for you. And that's also because of his definition of truth. Because he says, like, if you look at art, art is a lie. Like it's deforming certain aspects of reality, but it's so much more valuable than certain aspects of reality. So he's saying, like, sometimes we need certain lies, but then it depends on what you mean by lying or by truth. But I think there's something to be said, like, we shouldn't always, and that's also something against a more scientific understanding of the world. It's not necessarily the case that that which is more objective, that which we can all agree on is necessarily better. It might also sometimes be that actually that which is a little bit more chaotic, is a little bit more unstable, is a little bit more in flux, might also be more generative. And then I guess the ideal would be to bring those to an opponent processing again. So I really like the description you gave of that.
Well, it sounds like from the way you're describing Nietzsche when he talks about reality, he's thinking of reality as being what we're surrounded with.
Right. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. And of which we're also a part ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah. Where the way I understand, I think this is the way I've always thought about it in my simplistic way, but I think it's also the way that Dallas Willard talks about it, is that we are embedded basically in two realities, the one that is visible to us right now, but there's also an unseen reality. And the unseen reality is actually the real reality. And what we're in right now, yes, it can be twisted, and it can be all the things that you said that Nietzsche was concerned about. But that's because it's this imperfect human observed reality that we are in right now, and not the perfect reality of God's beautiful kingdom, which is right here next to us, maybe just one particle off. I don't know.
Yeah.
And at any moment, we can have moments where we see the other reality that we're embedded in.
Yeah, I would say, like, and this is also, I think it can be a valuable criticism of Nietzsche. So I think he would be concerned with a certain interpretation of what you just said, which is like very similar to Platonic understanding of reality. Is like, we have the eternal world of the eternal forms, and then we have, let's say, the sensible world, which is changing, which is in flux. And if we're not careful with the interpretation, we'd say like, okay, so this world is basically awful and that world is amazing, but you know, we don't live there. And so if we do it in that simplistic interpretation, which is how some Christians take it to be, you know, like that this world is bad and only that world is good. Yeah, we risk not valuing the life we have right now. And that's, I think, in the better understanding of Plato, and for your sake also of a Christian understanding of reality, is to say like, yes, but everything in this life is profoundly animated and nurtured by that world, right? So it's and the best moment is when we're able to see that it actually connects in that way, that it's like, oh, okay, actually in this world, like in looking at it, I can see something of that eternity, and otherwise we risk losing that. And I think Nietzsche would be concerned, like, okay,
which is exactly how we come to be prepared for that eternal world, is by dwelling in this world richly, right? And by learning and growing and confronting challenges and experiencing life in this world. And that's how we are growing and being prepared for
right,
the eternal world.
yeah.
So I mean, we have to be aware of the glory that is all around us. Yeah.
And I think that's just something that's very central to existentialist thought. So also Kierkegaard and to Sartre and Camus, is just to at least not take the afterlife for granted. Let's just for now just take for granted what's here and just focus on that, because we simply, you know, like we can believe in it, but we don't know what will happen when we die. This is, I think, an issue that everyone who believes and people who don't believe, even though interestingly enough most atheists who don't believe know for sure that nothing will happen when they die, which is very interesting, because I think most believers, like, they don't know but they believe. And that's why they're concerned, like, okay, let's at least focus on getting this life right, and then hopefully, and I think that's a beautiful way of putting it, that if you live this life the right way, in which this life is also fulfilled by it. So it's not like, you know, this was awful, but it prepares us for the better world. It's like, no, this was fully fulfilled by it. And if there's a better world, we're then also more fully capable of entering it.
So I was taking some notes on the other video I sent you. So you brought up existentialism, so I thought this might be a good place to drop this in. One of the things Dallas Willard said in his video on postmodernism and holiness, he said, modernism is about external control. Modernism is a rejection of the past as a guide to the present. But postmodernism is a continuation of the existential project of the emancipation of the individual from an imposed identity.
Yeah.
And he thinks that that's a very good thing, that that the individual does need to be emancipated from an imposed identity, and that part of the problem of the church in the modern era was to try to impose identity on the believer.
It's a good point. Yeah, it's I think there's a lot to be said for that interpretation, and that's also, if you look at the way that someone like Foucault looks at power, he'll also describe that, like, up to modern systems, you know, you had like a proper top-down way of governing. You know, you had the king and he was ruling over his subjects, and that's what happens in let's say in the 20th century much more, and then now in the 21st century where we're living, is power becomes less top-down, it becomes more horizontal, and we start disciplining each other in some ways, and that has advantages because there's new opportunities and potential for agency, but it also has disadvantages, that power becomes much more invisible. Like, we don't actually notice when we're disciplining each other or disciplining ourselves, whereas when there was a king, we just knew, like, okay, those are the guards, I need to be careful now, I need to, you know, pay attention. And I think in that same sense, I do think that was a problematic understanding of of something being too top down. So I think in modernism there is almost an insistence of a very, I should say it, a very limited understanding of what truth can be. So it's like, so we all submit to truth, but it's actually truth that is so severely weakened, which is why if you now hear discussions between, let's say, a scientist and well, either a postmodernist or someone else, or philosopher, or like even when you hear like a conversation between someone like Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, something like that. Sam Harris pretty modernist, so he's like, well, it's just obvious, like we have one reality and it's biological reality, and it's just this very much, at least I think from our perspective, a very watered down understanding of reality itself. So it's submitting to an authority, which is this truth, but the authority itself is weak. It's not life-giving. And then I think in this new space, and that's also why Peterson is actually far more postmodern than he'd like to admit. He's like, well, what do you mean by truth? So he opens up this possibility of like relating to it in a very new way. So you're no longer necessarily in submission to, you know, this weakened, watered down understanding of truth. And the risk of that, and that's also why there's risks to existentialism and risks to this era, is that you'll just submit to a political power of some sort, or you'll submit to your own desires, and that's the risk. But there is also a potential that, oh, now we see that we really have to rethink what truth is, and then we can maybe find, for instance, connections in these ancient traditions again. So I think I agree with what Dallas Willard said there, by the way. And I by the way, I really enjoyed the book you recommended. I managed to work through the abridged version and indeed the chapter you sent.
Wow,
He's a wonderful thinker. Yeah.
Yeah, chapter 3 is just, I think, amazing, because he the way he lays out the title of chapter 3 is What Jesus Knew.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, let's just assume that if you're going to accept Christianity at any level, let's just assume that Jesus was smart.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because you can't simultaneously think that Jesus is God and that he's not smart. You have to think he's
That's smart. A good point.
And so then you have to look at the things he said and say, if he's smart, then this must be the way that it is. And so how is it? And then when he breaks it all down and looking at it from that standpoint, you can see this complete picture of the way reality is in the kingdom of God is a much richer version of reality than say Sam Harris or anybody else would have. That's a strictly materialist perspective. Especially when he starts talking about, I've talked many times with a physicist who has this idea about information becoming physical, which is very obvious to a person if you think about it, because, if it's a computer program or if it's somebody's idea of how to build an airplane, that information can become physical in the real world, but the information is inside the head first. Right. And then that information is animated by the spirit within us. That's the spiritual, the mind and the will and the emotions are animating that idea so that idea can become physical in the real world. Well, if all you believe in is the particles, then it's very difficult to explain where that animating spirit comes from that is creating everything that's around us, right?
Yeah. Yeah, agreed. Yeah, I think it was really useful, and I think it's actually similar in some ways to, the whole biblical lectures. Like they started from this idea, like, well, maybe we could actually learn something from Genesis. So we start to look at Genesis again to be like, oh, maybe there's actually something there that we don't know yet. And the same thing is indeed, like the way that he presented it was really like, oh yeah, Jesus was actually kind of so radical that you just have to be like, oh yeah, he really knew what he was talking about in some ways. And also that, I don't know, like there was this emphasis, and for some reason, like you hear about this so many times if you have a history in Christian thinking, and at the same time it keeps surprising you that Jesus really like, don't focus on the rules, right? Like don't focus, like the rules are just the rules are this way of diminishing something, because if we focus too much on the rules, we think we're good people by, by following the rules, but actually maybe in our hearts we're not yet transformed. And this is actually, just to connect it back to a previous part of the conversation, I think Nietzsche would totally agree. It'd be like, if you're so focused on the rules, that's actually this resentment morality where it's like, I'm following the rules and they're not, so I'm good and they're not, but then you're actually not transformed from the inside. So I think it was so profoundly beautiful to go through that again. So I totally see that. And then as to your second point on the information becoming, I think material, was it? What was it? What you said?
I mean, he uses the word physical, but yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No. And that's in that same way. That's also a very Platonic understanding, right? Like that there's these aspectualizations, and they end up having physical manifestations, and that's why if you read like it's very interesting if you look at someone like Whitehead. He actually makes the claim that Plato's Timaeus was a far better model of understanding. I think was it Whitehead or Heisenberg? I'm not sure. Maybe both of them said something similar, but that Plato's Timaeus was a far better model for understanding our current observations of quantum mechanics than the Scholium by Newton, which was a far more recent work. So you think it would be more up to date, but actually what we find now, like in quantum mechanics, is like, well, it's much more about probabilities and about certain mathematical properties, which seem far closer to, like, let's say, a Platonic understanding, where it's mathematical properties that structure the material which is in our world. And therefore, indeed, that it is starting with these nominal ideas, which then are able to have manifestations in the world in which we live. So I think that's a really beautiful understanding. And I actually think there's some good reasons to think that it might be true.
Well, I did, a while back, I started reading the Book of John, trying to read it in the interlinear version so that I could look at the Greek and the English at the same time, because I'm not a student of Greek. But but when you do that, the first chapter of the Book of John is mind-blowingly close to quantum physics.
Elaborate, please.
Yeah. And it also reminds me, when I was in graduate school back in the 80s, one of the class, my major was linguistics when I was in graduate school, but one of the classes I had to take was I had to have one classical literature class to complete the master's. And so I picked Milton, and it was a small seminar of 5 students with a teacher, and we were doing Milton's Paradise Lost, which was
amazing
experience. But one of the guys that was in there was a guy who was working on his doctorate in quantum physics, and he had to have a literature class. And so he had come in, and he just kept going off. This is mind blowing. He said, this is quantum physics right here in Milton. I took copious notes during that whole seminar because this guy's mind just fascinated me so much, but then I lost the notes. So I can't remember what it was he said, but the way that Milton talks about the creation of the universe and the way the universe is put together and everything just seemed to this guy to fit right into the whole aspect of quantum physics.
Right.
But
that's amazing.
But let's pull it back a little bit here. I do want to get, I don't know how many more times I get to talk to you, so I want to ask another question. One of the quotes that Dallas Willard said, and I don't know if this has anything to do with Nietzsche or not, but he said he was quoting a guy named Ernest Barker, who said the core of democracy is choice and not something chosen. And he wasn't necessarily quoting that as saying this is a good thing. He was just quoting it. Okay. But it made me think that part of where we're at today is that we have magnified choice to such an extent that we have so many choices now that we have no way to make a choice.
Right. Yeah.
If you just think about supermarkets, you used to go in and there would be 1 or 2 kinds of dish soap and 1 or 2 kinds of bread and 1 or 2, you had some choices and you could make a choice and pick something and take it home. Now you go into a supermarket and there would be an entire shelf of 15 different kinds of dish soap. And it's like, how do I make a decision?
Yeah.
And it comes down to, I think the point that Willard was trying to make is that we put ourselves in a prison if we say that freedom is freedom to have anything we want, because then we have no idea what we want. And so then what good is the freedom? Basically, we're in a prison because now we have so many choices, so many options,
Hmm.
but no way of knowing what it is we really want. So I don't know if that
Right.
ties into Nietzsche at all.
I'm not sure if it ties into Nietzsche. I think he is like he was very critical of our notions of free will, but that's again, that's I said this dual aspect of Nietzsche. It's this second aspect where um, like there's the story of the lambs and the birds of prey. Um, According to him, this was in that story you can find an analogy that the lambs more or less invented free will. It's like, the birds of prey, they could not eat us, but they eat us like they choose to. Whereas from the birds of prey perspective, they just do it. Like they don't think about wanting to do it. It's just like they just want it and then they do it. So there's no free will happening. So he's actually saying our notions of free will came about in some ways as a mechanism to understand our weakness because we want to project like, hey, you could also not do that. And it's actually been useful for other things. But that's why he's very critical of it, because he thinks like, okay, yeah, it also gives us this impression that we're this, that we're super free to do whatever we want. And even if something like free will exists, which I think actually there's many good arguments for, but if it does, like it's obviously not like that you could do whatever you like. Like I can't choose to become a tiger right now. Like it's always bound within specific domains. And then we can argue, okay, what are the domains in which that is bound? Uh, and as for this one, I do think that's so interesting because we always tie that notion of free will in some ways to Christianity. I know at least many people do, but this notion of free will is far more capitalist, right? Like it's this understanding of just, pick and choose whatever you like. And then also with that ties into our current understanding of democracy. It's just whatever you want, you can choose whatever you like. And that's really the problematic notion because it implies no sense of first being in some way determined or at least informed, let me put it that way, by certain virtues, which would allow you to make a good choice in the first place. But the ironic thing is, the more we are determined by certain virtues, the less free we are in some ways, but also the more free we are. So it depends on what you mean then by freedom. But in terms of that, just freedom to choose whatever you want, if I'm fully determined by justice, then I'm not so free to be unjust. But it might be that in that conceptualization, I feel more free because I'm actually doing something that I can continuously do without falling back into or sliding back into, let's say, feeling super bad about myself. It's just like it's this continuum of acting according to how I would want to act. But at the same time, it's fully determined by a certain virtue. And that's what complicates this question so much.
Well,
I'm not sure.
Willard
Yeah.
says that his definition of freedom would be like, um, is it's not the freedom to sit in your mother's basement and eat Cheetos while you're playing video games, but it's the freedom that you can see when you see a concert pianist sit down to play a
Right.
symphony, right?
It's
And I
majestic.
have
Yeah.
I have a friend who's a concert pianist who travels all over the world playing symphonies, and
Mm,
um, when she sits down to play at the piano, there is tremendous freedom.
exactly.
Okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
But she rehearses 6 hours a day
Mm,
and has her entire life. And she's
right.
like 50 years old now. She still rehearses six
Yeah.
hours a day. That freedom is bought at the cost of sitting your butt down on the piano bench and
Yeah.
playing for 6 hours a day, right?
At the cost of discipline. Yeah. And that's, I think, in so the recent talk of Bishop Barron, I'm not sure if you watched it, but it's at the ARC conference, but he also discusses the concept of freedom. And he also says, like, you're perfect, you can be, he says, like, I'm perfectly free in the English language right now, but I wouldn't be so free in speaking French to you right now. And that would take some skill and some time to acquire freedom there. But that would also mean that, like, to discipline myself in such a way. So you're more free in the English language than I am at the moment, but I'm more free in the Dutch language than you are. And in that same sense, you can definitely compare that to musical skills. And that does tie into Nietzsche's notion of will to power, that if we're able to express that thing which, let's say, this is a problematic notion for several reasons, but I'll use the word anyways, which authentically belongs to ourselves. So that might be different per individual, but that thing in which you have to explore your own potential, if you work that out and if you actualize that potential, that's when you express your will to power, and that's actually when you experience life as most meaningful, and likely when you experience yourself as most free, because otherwise you're just bound by these frustrations of not being able to live in the way you like. But you like you can see how just language by itself, it complicates our ability to make this very clear at the moment.
Well, the way you just described that, that sounds actually like quite a positive attribute. But I take it that there are complications with that as well. So,
well, because he also problematized the notion of free will, he'd say, okay, what is it you want? Like, you don't know what you want. So like Nietzsche is also, and I already mentioned, he's like the first proto psychoanalytic thinker in some sense. He says we're not transparent to ourselves, and that's why one of his most famous quotes, I mean, he has many, but this is one of them, is become who you are having found out what that is. So it's like, so that's already a paradoxical statement, to become who you are, because you still have to become apparently who you are, which suggests that, okay, you don't know yet who you are, you have to figure that out. So you can only be that like after you figure out what it is that you become, and then maybe you can find out what you want. But that also means that often when we're acting in the present, we might not be acting on our own self-interest, because maybe it's like our future self-interest, and maybe that actually has the best interest for us in mind. But that's always very difficult, and I think that's also typical of Nietzsche. Like, maybe for some people who are not introduced to Nietzsche before, this will all sound very confusing, but that's also because Nietzsche is sort of purposefully trying to contradict himself, because he doesn't want this just one exclusive, I should say it, concise explanation of his ideas. He wants there to be tension, just like he said there was a productive tension in the Apollonian and Dionysian.
one of the difficulties that jumps out at me as you're talking about this conundrum that he puts himself in is that how do you ever move forward? How do you ever do anything if you have to question everything all the time? Then you have no. I mean, it's kind of like when Jordan Peterson talks about being at the threshold of the next moment, being confronted by an infinity of choices and completely immobilized by that, unless you have a higher goal that is going to organize that set of choices in front of you. It's going to constrain or limit the field from which you get to choose.
Yeah, no, I mean, so as I already said at the start, like, my fascination for him is not unlike my fascination for Walter White in Breaking Bad or Tony Soprano in The Sopranos. Like, I also know that eventually he ended up having a mental breakdown, and I do think that's fairly related to his philosophical ideas, that even though I think there's something to be said for, being brave amidst change, because let's be honest, like, there's a lot of change happening right now, and all of us need to be brave in the face of that. And we shouldn't deny the fact that there is change in this world, and that therefore, we need to cultivate our character in such a way that we can withstand that. And at the same time, he was so convinced of that any stability was suspect. Any stability at all became suspect at some point. And then it's hard to see what really remains of reality. And especially in his later years when he was living, he became just profoundly lonely. So then, the stable relationships that you at some point had to maybe keep you a little bit more grounded are then also lost. And then it's just the Dionysian aspect at the expense of everything else. So I think he has a valuable project in really trying to revive both of them, and also seeing the value in stability, in indeed this groundedness and this higher ideal. But he ends up just moving towards the exclusive position of flux in his later years, which is very unfortunate.
Well, that's so the last question I had, and I don't know, do you have time for one more question?
Yeah, I have some time. Yes.
Okay, I'll try to make it as brief as possible.
No need to.
So there's apparently an idea in Nietzsche. I started watching a video about this. I didn't finish the whole video, although it's very interesting. Is that forgetfulness is an active and positive force. He had this idea about forgetfulness being an active and positive force.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you a frame of why I'm asking the question, because I'm very interested in entropy. And I've had many conversations with physicists and biologists about the concept of entropy, which is way more complicated and interesting than one might think. And my physicist friend says that one of the ways that he thinks about entropy is that it's a kind of forgetfulness. And it's a forgetfulness that sort of allows space for new things to happen.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting.
And so I wondered if you could talk about Nietzsche's idea about forgetfulness, and maybe we could find some intersections.
Yeah.
When I was listening to the video, the light bulb started going off.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. I mean, I should just emphasize that Nietzsche always, like, he called himself a psychologist. So for him, kind of similar to Peterson almost, like that he was interested in explaining things in terms of human motivations. That's really what interested him. So I'm not sure if I could give you like a cosmic answer from a Nietzschean perspective.
Oh no, I don't need a cosmic answer. I just want Nietzsche's answer.
Yeah. No, so we've discussed the notion of like resentment throughout this, and he actually thinks that if you have a good memory, that might actually be a sign of resentment. So it might be that you have not dealt with things in your past that you're still profoundly resentful about. And actually, if you don't have a good memory, then that just shows that, you know, the past is not so relevant to you right now. It's like you're seeing each day with new eyes, and you're able to just go into the world with, you know, new motivations. And that's all because you're taking it in the moment, and you're not living in the past. So there's something very brave and useful about forgetfulness. And he actually thinks that, yeah, like, and we sometimes hear these stories of people like confronting their childhood bullies or something like that. And that just shows how actually profoundly unhappy they've been for all their lives, because they've lived in this shadow of just, you know, just this having been bullied by this person maybe 40 years ago. And there's something to that. But at the same time, maybe that bully didn't care about it at all. And maybe that bully forgot about it already. Maybe that bully therefore is living a better life. So there's something to be said for the positive potential of not living in the past, and forgetfulness, even though it sounds like a negative thing, actually being a positive thing, because it demonstrates that we're profoundly relating to the present and the future and what's ahead, as opposed to what's constantly in the past. That would be a short answer, but yeah, I'm curious if that brings up any connections.
It does point up what he's talking about. If the aspect of forgetfulness is that it allows you to move into the future without carrying this weight along with you, it opens up a more creative opportunity, right?
Yeah. And he was also concerned, by the way, just on a more societal level, that you know, this is like the whole death of God notion, that there are still certain elements. It's not so easy that, you know, when people stop believing in God, that therefore God no longer has a force. So he's also like, okay, we're also not able to easily forget as a society, and that can be dangerous, because then we start to how should I say it? We start misjudging. Like, we start to delude ourselves about what we actually believe in, because we say we believe in this thing, but actually we're still profoundly influenced by this thing in the past. So therefore he also says, in that sense, it's like forgetfulness can then also be a force to be really be like, okay, no, I have to leave that behind me, and I have to move on to the new thing in life. So it can also not just be like something that occurs to you, but actually something that you want to place into your life. And now that's in comparison to God, but I think that can also be to much more hopeful values, let's say.
Wow. Yeah, that's super interesting. I'm going to percolate on that, because one of the things that one of the aspects of entropy, and I think I've got this right, I could be wrong because I'm also not a scientist, is that entropy is a measure of the free energy that is still available for work, or of the free energy that is no longer available for work or something. Anyway, entropy is a measurement. So entropy isn't actually a thing, it's just a measurement. So in that sense, you could think of forgetfulness as being a kind of a measurement. And when I think about measurement, it starts to stack up into a kind of a hierarchy almost, where the ideal is always a judge. Judge measures, right? So or we measure ourselves against the ideal, and therefore we become our own judge because we are measured against this ideal. So if entropy is a measurement, then maybe it's an aspect of how something lines up against the ideal. And so I'm going to percolate on that a little bit.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Nietzsche, by the way, he's also very explicit about that notion that every ideal is necessarily a judge. That's like, he says something similar himself, and also like he calls Dionysus at some point a judge, because he reintroduces Dionysus as this new ideal, and therefore he says like, now Dionysus come down to judge us, and that then relates back to the start of this conversation where we talked about the hammer, right? It's like we start to see where there are any cracks. So I really like how we've come full circle in this conversation. It's very interesting, and I'm really impressed by like that, by how many things you don't have, let's say, a trained background in, and nonetheless you are interested in it, and therefore you're able to relate all these very seemingly specific ideas to all these widely like different aspects, such as art and then physics. So like I'm very much impressed by it.
Well, it's because I don't know anything. It allows me to be a little bit brave about drawing comparisons that maybe aren't there, but at the same time, it gives me something to
Right.
kind of ways of thinking about things.
Yeah, and I mean, how would you ever know otherwise if you wouldn't venture out there, right?
Yeah, so maybe to finish up, we should quote something from Dallas Willard, since that's where we started from.
Good, yeah.
Here's one I like. This is in this chapter 3, What Jesus Knew. He says, he was not speaking metaphorically or abstractly. The same is true when Jesus chided Nicodemus, who took himself to be a teacher in Israel, for not understanding the birth from above, the receiving of a superhuman kind of life from the God who is literally with us in surrounding space. To be born from above in New Testament language means to be interactively joined with a dynamic, unseen system of divine reality, in the midst of which all of humanity moves about, whether it knows it or not. And that, of course, is the kingdom among us.
Wow. Amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. And then again, at the very end of the chapter, he says, at the literally mundane level, Jesus was the master of molecules. He knew how to transform the molecular structure of water to make it wine. That knowledge also allowed him to take a few pieces of bread and some little fish and feed thousands of people. He could create matter from the energy he knew how to access from the heavens right where he was. All these things show Jesus's cognitive and practical mastery of every phase of reality, physical, moral, and spiritual. He is master only because he is maestro. Jesus is Lord can mean little in practice for anyone who has to hesitate before saying Jesus is smart.
That's great. That's great. If ever, by the way, if ever you get the chance to talk to my dad, who my brother also has conversation with, because he is just a specialist on the whole of Nietzsche's life, he actually tries to treat, let's say, Jesus as much as possible as a human individual, and just try to understand from his perspective, like what must that have been like to grow up in that time and have those expectations laid upon you and that understanding. So it'd be interesting to have like a contrast with, because I think, it's almost like he would say, okay, well, Nietzsche was also very unsure about certain things, and he was trying to figure stuff out. So it will be interesting to see those two perspectives and how they line up together. But that's something for a wholly different conversation, obviously.
Well, maybe all three of you should come on sometime. Have a free for all.
I'd love that. Yeah, that sounds good. Amazing.
So much, Aron. This has been really great.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Okay. Have a great day.
Yeah, thank you. You too.